Welcome to Complicating the Narrative, a podcast that takes on the challenging questions in public health by embracing complexity rather than avoiding it. I'm your host, Salma Abdallah, an assistant professor at Washington University School of Public Health. One of the reasons I started this podcast was to hold space for big ideas in public health, ideas that do not fit neatly into a data table or policy brief, but push us to imagine what's possible. My guest today is doing exactly that. Dr. Paul Fleming is an associate professor at the University of Michigan, whose scholarship and teaching focus on health equity and social justice. Many listeners may know him from his newsletter, where he's been wrestling with what it would mean to build a better, more just world. His forthcoming book, Imagine Doing Better: Why Policies Backfire and How Prevention Thinking Can Change Everything, expands on those writings, offering both a bold vision and concrete steps for change. In the book, Paul lays out the case to reimagine healthcare, education, the environment, the prison system, and public safety, pointing to the policies and practices that might actually get us there. I don't agree with every argument or framing Paul makes, but I admire the clarity of his argument and his courage to put forward a vision. So much of our field stops just at describing problems, and I think we're in a moment that requires that kind of bold thinking. So today, we're going to talk through Paul's approach to public health and his new book. Along the way, I want to discuss with him some bigger questions. How should we navigate the line between values and evidence in public health writing? And when we write, should we try to persuade skeptics or try to build a map for those who already share our commitments, or both? Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start maybe first to talk about your career, your research, but also the work you did with communities in Michigan and abroad, as well as the increasingly interest you have in writing for the public. Maybe walk me through what got you interested in prevention and what is one area that you focused on early on in your career that you thought this is really important, that you later on thought, oh, this is just completely wrong, and I need to focus on other issues to advance prevention thinking.
Yeah, what a great question to start with. I was raised by a teacher and an engineer, and so I think part of who I am ultimately from the teacher side is somebody who wants to contribute to their community, and from the engineer side, someone who wants to solve complex problems and create solutions. And so I think putting those two things together, in hindsight, it makes sense to me that I ended up in a field like public health, where we are trying to solve big problems and we are trying to contribute to our community. But to be honest, when I was an undergraduate, I had no idea what public health was. I think there's a lot of folks who have that similar trajectory. And I'm not one of those people that, always wanted to be a doctor or a nurse. So health was really not on my radar, to be honest. Um, what really changed things for me was I became a Peace Corps volunteer after I graduated college. Like I said, I was sort of interested in giving back to my community, contributing to the global community in some way. And so Peace Corps appealed for those reasons. But it also really transformed me. One of the things some people might not know about Peace Corps is Peace Corps volunteers only go where they're invited. So they first have to be invited by the country's government, and then the local communities themselves have to invite a Peace Corps volunteer into the community. And so that sort of ethos stuck with me. And the other thing that really was taught or trained as a Peace Corps volunteer is when you arrive somewhere, do not try to do something right away. Your first job is to listen, listen, listen. And in fact, we were really encouraged to spend those first 6 months. Typically, Peace Corps is a 2-year stint, and we were really encouraged to spend those first 6 months just getting to know people, building relationships, understanding how people lived, how people thought, what brought people joy, what were their concerns, what institutions existed, how were they working together, what were divisions. And so it was through that process that I really learned sort of that ethos of listening and building relationships as a core foundation of the work we do. I was assigned to be a community health volunteer, and that's where the public health lens comes through. So through that, I learned what community-based public health is. I learned what it is to work alongside community members to try to improve health outcomes, improve well-being. For each other's neighbors, for people in schools, for workplaces, and the whole community. And so it's through that process that I ultimately decided, I think public health might be the field for me. And as I continue to do my work, I want to do it in the same way that I was doing as a Peace Corps volunteer. I want to do it where I am leading with relationships first. I am leading from a place of listening to community, and then working together, each bringing a unique perspective and skill set to solving the most challenging problems. So ultimately, I went on to pursue graduate training in public health, always kind of focused on this area of community based health. Um, and as I did that work, because I had been a Peace Corps volunteer, I was initially doing that work in a global health context. So I was working primarily in different Latin American countries, and really trying to do the work of supporting local communities and advancing health. Initially, I was working in HIV prevention, but eventually that expanded. And as I went through my career, as I went through my training, I started to just notice the patterns that I think a lot of us noticed, these inequities within communities, and that those inequities persist across a range of outcomes. And of course, I was working in the public health space, but as I told you originally, health was not my passion, right? Ultimately, it was about building better communities. So yes, the health outcomes were inequitable, but so were the education outcomes. So were the outcomes related to who was more likely to be put into prison. So were outcomes across a range of issues. And so that's ultimately what led me to sort of think less about specific diseases or specific health issues and try to shift the lens more broadly of how do we bring this relationship first, and community driven solution approach to building a better society across a range of issues. And that's kind of what led me today, and led me to read ultimately write the book that I wrote.
This is so interesting. I think maybe on two levels. The first one, not necessarily interesting for everyone, but my parents are a teacher and an engineer. So I
Oh.
just, I found that's a really good way to think about growing up thinking from an engineering mindset. What does it mean to do work, but also from a teacher's mindset? I fully agree with your description of how that actually shapes your thinking about the world.
I
Um,
wonder how many of us in public health share that background, because I think it does connect in a lot of ways.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think the other part, which is really helpful, I was reading your book. I come from scholarship that focuses on social and economic policies and how those shape health outcomes. And I kept reading the book and thinking, this is the perfect book for someone who wants to write about how social determinants of health can help health outcomes. And I think this answers the question for me because a lot of the people who write about social determinants of health, we don't necessarily think about the broader vision of the world. We think about it just from a health perspective. And I do think coming with the mindset of I want to improve the world and then adding a health lens to it is really helpful. I keep saying that to my students when I teach classes on the social determinants of health or health economic policies. Um, what they ask me, what should they do? And I usually think you probably want to work somewhere that is not the public health department. You want to work in the transportation department, in the education department, and then provide a health lens. Maybe we should think about it differently now in class. Maybe I should tell them when they start the program, maybe the way to think about it, instead of saying, I just want to focus on public health, I want to improve what affects people's lives, and then health will come in the process. Because if we fix education, if we focus on a better justice system, that will likely improve the health of outcomes of people. So that was interesting to me. I was wondering, like, why did you take such a strong social determinants of health perspective? And it just made me realize it's because you actually were thinking about a holistic approach to how do you live better, and then social determinants of health just came along the way. So just been thinking about your book. You've been writing that newsletter for a few years now, I think. Um, I
That's right. Yeah.
wondered, yeah, I was wondering what made you decide now's the time I want to write a book. What was the moment that you thought, oh, maybe I should put everything together in a comprehensive way? Were the newsletter and the book complementary to each other, or did you take the ideas from the newsletter and then build them into a book?
Just to give a little more context for the newsletter, I write a newsletter called "Making a Better World Possible," and really that started. I like to try to lean into creativity and just kind of thinking differently. And where that started from was I it came from the same place, the same root as the book, which was I think there's so much ideas and thinking and lenses that we have in public health that we use that could really be applied more broadly. And one of those is this idea of prevention thinking, and that is a focus of the book. It's also a focus of the field of public health. And the newsletter itself, I initially started it as a snail mail newsletter. The idea was I'm not trying to add another email to your
Yeah.
inbox. I want something a little more personal. And to me, that really leaned on principles not only from public health, but also community organizing, where it is about that personal touch. It's about the relationships. It's about the human human connection. And I felt like sending people a piece of mail was was a stronger connection, a better way to engage people than another email in their inbox. I personally, when I get an email in my inbox, I'm thinking about how quickly I can get rid of it or quickly respond to it, right? And so I wanted to lean on that different approach. And so I think for the newsletter was really trying to think beyond just the field of public health to thinking about, well, if we are somebody who lives in a given community, how do we think about making this community better? How do we think about what we can do? And so, one of the things was writing the book actually happened alongside the development of the newsletter
Mm.
because if you know, writing a book takes a long time. So I've
Yeah.
actually been working on the book for probably 4 or 5 years now, and so some of the ideas that I was writing about in the book, I was like, well, this doesn't necessarily neatly fit into a chapter that I'm thinking about, but I kind of want to explore them. So I've always felt like writing is an outlet for me
Mm.
to process ideas, to get feedback from other people. And so I think the newsletter afforded me that opportunity to not only bring public health ideas and this prevention thinking and making a world a better place ideas to a broader audience, but it also helped me hone some of the ideas that ultimately made it into the book.
Yeah. So maybe just we'll start talking about the book itself right now. I think the listeners probably got a good idea of what prompted you to think about prevention, a long term, a vision for prevention thinking when it comes to health outcomes. The central thesis was asking people to imagine what would it mean for our great 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 grandchildren. I think I got it right. Maybe 7 generations.
Yeah.
Um, what would it mean for them to think about what we're doing right now, and what would they say about the choices we're making right now and in the world we're living in? And I wondered, why would you frame a public health book thinking about a distant generation, and what do you think imagining possibilities for 7 generations from now provide us in terms of a map road for what we need to do compared to just having data or evidence for the moment?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question, and I want to be clear that that 7 generations perspective comes from indigenous thinking, and there were indigenous groups in the U.S. and elsewhere who, when they were thinking about major decisions for their tribe or for their society, were thinking, let's frame it in 7 generations in the future. What decisions should we make today for those future generations? So I found that. I found that idea very inspiring, right? And so thinking about that future orientation made a lot of sense to me because in public health, what we're ultimately thinking about is how do we create better environments for people where they can actually live, work, play in a way that helps them thrive and be healthy. Because as you mentioned with the social determinants of health, right? If we only focus on the health, we're kind of missing the boat, right? Because so many of the things that are actually shaping health and shaping well-being are the other aspects of people's lives. And so if we broaden that context, think about the environments that we're creating, how do we build a better world? And we do need to use this future orientation because there are ways, and we've seen it in our society, there are ways that we can start building a world that might create prosperity and thriving in the next couple of years, this short-term thinking, right? But it ultimately leads to harms. I think climate change is the prime example of this, right? There were things that were done to create wealth and prosperity, but now our generation is facing some of the consequences. Our children's generation is going to face even more of the consequences. And if we remain on this trajectory, it's going to get even worse, right? And so I think that future orientation actually helps us build thriving communities, but also sustainable communities. sustainable communities where um, we are contributing and building a world that works for us, works for our children, and works for the generations that come after. So, when I was pulling the book together, that concept really just kept on coming to the fore, and that's really an idea that I wanted to anchor us in, because if we only are focusing on the present day, if we are only focusing on the moment we're in, we lose such perspective. We lose perspective to have an imagination of what could be. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, so often we are thinking about, oh, what's this policy that we have right now, and what would be a small tweak we can make? And that can be important, right? That's very practical. Sometimes our state legislatures are deciding and debating those things. So it makes sense to focus there. But what if we did something a little bit different and said, well, let's pretend we don't have anything in place. What is that world that we want to build from scratch? Now, unfortunately, we likely don't really get the opportunity to build a world from scratch, because we're living in the decisions our ancestors made, and then our future generations will live in the decisions that we make. Um, but if we step away from the sort of hyper focus on what is in front of us and really dream of what societies could be, what communities could be, I think we get to different solutions. And so I think part of your question was asking, why not just look at sort of data and evidence? And those things are important, don't get me wrong. But I think it can constrain our thinking for what the solution is. If we are narrowly looking at data, data is limited in certain ways. If we're narrowly looking at data, it might point us to narrow solutions. If we use our creativity and imagination, we might be able to find different solutions. And then in that case, we can still use data to explore what those solutions look like. So I think that combination can be really lead us to a different place.
I actually want to talk about the line between presenting evidence for a problem that exists, but also then providing a normative statement about what needs to be done, and can we walk that line in our public health writing slash would we sometimes blur the line? And if we do that, what could happen if we actually do that? I think a framing I liked in the beginning of the book was, and I think this is exactly what you're talking about, thinking about reformist reform or non-reformist reform. I thought that was just a really good framing of the type of solutions we can envision if we just rely on the data or the information we need for a decision maker today versus the information we need to just maybe reimagine a better world. So do you want to tell us a bit about that distinction between reformist reform and non-reformist reform?
Sure, yeah, and this is an idea that stems from different kind of social theorists, and then also community organizers. Abolitionists specifically talk a lot about this, where we have different institutions in place, we have different policies in place, and in many cases they've been in place for generations. And thinking about reformist reforms is the idea that you are just kind of tweaking around the edges. You are making changes to that system that further entrench the system, make that system. But in public health, one of the things we do is we study systems. We study how different systems in our society and institutions do shape health outcomes, right? There is, speaking of the data, there's a lot of different data on actions by institutions that cause harm within our communities. And so if we think about reformist reforms, those are further entrenching those systems. And so if we think more about transformative solutions, that is thinking about how do we actually transform systems? How do we actually um, reimagine systems so that they are not perpetuating harms and they're actually contributing to communities thriving. So I think that's a really important distinction that we need to be thinking about when we talk about our policies and our institutions. What is the transformation that's needed? And sometimes that transportation or transformation may take years or generations to put into place. So it's not necessarily to say that this can happen overnight or will happen overnight. But again, if we're just thinking in this short term perspective of like what's possible for next week or next year, then we lose the opportunity to think bigger about what are the systems, what are the resources, what are the supports, what are the institutions that we need in our society so that we can all thrive.
Yeah. So then thinking more concretely about the areas that you suggest non-reformers reforms you talk about the healthcare system, the environment, the education system, the prison system, and public safety. And in each one of those chapters, you start by asking, uh, is our current approach really designed for prevention, or should we imagine something different? So, two things actually. The first one is I appreciate you starting each chapter by thinking about your personal story and how that aligns or differs from personal stories from other people who grew up in communities that might be in the US, but are very different from the ones that you grew up in. But I also wondered, why did you end up picking those five areas? As I said, I work on economic systems, so I always think about income distribution as an area that I'm mostly interested in, which is not one of the areas that you focus on.
I did feel I chose areas that I felt like I had some familiarity or work experience with,
Yeah.
and so that's ultimately how they were chosen. But I appreciate the question because I actually think that if I would have crowdsourced other chapters, for example, I could have invited you to write a chapter on economic systems or other things, and I think there's so many different areas. Economic or financial systems, our political institutions, um, our policies related to agriculture and farming. Um, there's policies related to international relations, the military, et cetera. There's so many things that you could apply this thinking to. Um, Ultimately, my editor and publisher told me that I couldn't write an endless book,
Yeah.
which I appreciated. But yeah, I focused. I mean, I think healthcare and health was a natural one because obviously working in the field of public health, that's sort of our bread and butter. But the environment, public safety, prisons, and education is all something that I've had, work or personal experience that touches on connected to that, and so it felt like a natural fit to be able to write about it. But I appreciate your point that there are other areas that aren't necessarily covered in the book that I think this thinking could apply to.
And to be honest, I think those are areas that you might get broad support or interest around across different ways of thinking and values because they're about issues that people deal with on a daily basis. So I thought those were five interesting areas. I just wasn't sure if there was a plan behind it, but maybe this is an idea for your next book or an edited book where you just ask people to write about different domains. I
Yep.
did enjoy those five domains. So I think healthcare. A lot of people here might know some of the arguments for healthcare, and I was also thinking some of the arguments maybe for the education system. The one that really stuck with me was the public safety chapter, as well as the prison system. So maybe you can just tell us a bit about the overarching argument for both of those.
Sure. Yeah. So let me start with the place of some of the public health research that's been done on those systems. So um, there's been a lot of research actually over the years, especially in the last decade, trying to from epidemiologists and others, trying to really document, well, what is the harm of these systems? And so, for example, there's evidence showing that for every year that somebody's in prison, it takes off years of their life expectancy.
Hmm.
There's evidence around what having a parent or neighbor or community member imprisoned does on the broader society relate or broader community, I should say, related to mental health and other outcomes related to health. So these are important things that public health can document and identify as these our criminal legal system is contributing to poor health in these different ways. Same with policing. We still see that over 1,000 people each year are killed by police in our country. That number has not gone down over the years, despite the increased attention to the killing of people by police. That disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people in this country. So not only are there poor health outcomes associated with some of these institutions, there are inequities which we're very familiar with in public health, and so I want to start there by just saying this is something that the field of public health has studied for a long time and identified some of these concerns, and so that was ultimately my starting place. Um, and then kind of applying the prevention thinking lens and the lens that I try to bring to the whole book of thinking about, well, how can we imagine systems that might do this a bit better? And I think we get to a place when I talk about prevention thinking, I'm talking about the need to identify root causes. And so if we think about root causes, right, the prison system and the criminal legal system is trying to address the very important problem of crime in our communities and in our country. There is violence, there's sometimes theft and stealing and other things um, that that also to some extent are public health issues, or at least the violence piece is certainly a public health issue, and we want to be preventing those things. And so if you bring a root cause perspective of what is causing people to commit violence in the first place, or what is causing people to steal in the first place, if you keep kind of peeling back the onion on that, you get to a different place of what the solutions might be. So you get to a place where, you know, violence can be caused by a variety of issues, but the solution to violence, or what the kind of leading people who study violence, the prevention of it is not necessarily putting somebody in a prison, but rather providing increased social supports, uh, supports for families, supports for communities. There is large evidence around violence disruptors within communities that is an effective solution for violence within communities. And so those solutions are often underfunded, whereas we are funding. So I think budget is a thing that hasn't come up in this conversation yet, but budget is a big part of what we're talking about in the book, which is where are we allocating our resources? And if we think about the prison system, we are allocating billions and billions of dollars to keep somebody in a prison. For example, and I don't have the stats right in front of me, but oftentimes we're talking about a cost per person imprisoned of 40 to 50,000 per year. Now that is an average wage in a lot of places in our society, right? And so if we think about the fact that we're investing that much money, well, what are we getting from that investment? And that, I think, is a core way to sort of shift the question, or shift the idea for a solution. What do we get from that investment? Because what we know from public health evidence is that one of the things we get is that there are some harms on the communities. The community where people are increasingly imprisoned has poor health as a result of that, because they have community members that are taken away. And so if we think about the investment differently, what if we invest in these communities, provide more resources for people who are at risk, or for communities where this is happening? And so I think it's a matter of how do we use the money that we're already dedicating effectively. And I think with I'll just touch, since you asked about it, for policing, it's a similar idea, right? A lot of city budgets, 30 to 40% of them are going to paying for policing. And that is in response to communities wanting to ensure a safe community. Now, if we think about what promotes public safety, there are other ways to get there than police. And one of the things that I write about in the book is one of the things that police do is they respond to emergencies. That's an extremely important function that we need in every community, right? You or I could have an emergency, and we want people to be responsive. We want people to show up and help us in our time of need. Unfortunately, in our communities, our thinking has been, and our imagination has been constrained, where we think police who have a certain training are the only people that can respond in that emergency. And the reality is that we can think of other resources that we put in place in our communities. Unarmed non-police response programs are showing up across the country as an emerging idea that is thinking a little bit differently about public safety. So if there's public nuisance or something going on and somebody wants support other than police, We can send in social workers. We can send in folks with conflict de-escalation. That leads to a different outcome. That outcome leads to a person being connected to health and social services rather than being placed into our criminal legal system that can lead to things like imprisonment, leading to harder times to get jobs, leading to impacts on communities. So I think part of those chapters are really just thinking about we are making huge investments as a society into these areas, into specifically imprisoning people and putting police in our communities. What would it what would it look like to think differently, imagine differently how we build public safety in our society through different investments?
Yeah. So I was going to ask about this later, but I think it's relevant right now, and it's part of what I was wondering about giving the evidence, providing a normative statement, but also thinking, are we trying to convince skeptics versus trying to provide a roadmap for those who already agree with the vision presented in the book? And I think the question there for me is two things. The first one is, what if someone has a value of saying those are all important things, fine, but I do think I want to make sure if someone does something that harms anyone in the community, they actually face what they perceive to be justice. And what would be an argument that gets that person to be invested in your vision versus saying, well, there are other ways to actually deal with this within the system. So that's the first question. The second one is, and I wonder about this. I think you said at the end of the public safety chapter that maybe one way to think about this is exactly what you said, budgets. And there are other ways that we can help communities and engage with communities, and communities themselves propose that focus on the services needed instead of just having the police going into emergency settings, which is sometimes I said they're not even trained to do, and that might also present danger to the police themselves. It ended with saying, and that would necessarily lead us to think maybe that the budget for the police should shrink/stagnate versus everything else increasing. And I wondered if someone really feels strongly about the needing the police in their community, which we see that in a lot of the polling that is done across communities, would it be more helpful to argue with them that yes, we need to invest in other areas without presenting the argument that we need to stagnate/shrink police budget? Like, would that be a better route that gets people from different value perspectives or different ways of thinking to engage with this argument?
Yeah, such a great question, and I'll try to answer both of them. I think first off, what I would say is I don't view myself as the best person to be making decisions for other people's communities.
Yeah.
So, starting from where I was earlier in the podcast, I come from a kind of ethos of community-led decision making, and so I think for communities that want to make those investments, um, that is a choice that they can make as a community. Now, what I think is really important is that everybody within that community is a part of that decision making process, which I think we often see that in a lot of communities, people are left out of decision making process, especially marginalized groups. Either have less access to voting, less access to civic participation, et cetera. So, but I think communities absolutely should be making these types of decisions, and communities need to be aware of what is possible. So I think a lot of people, when asked the question about police in their neighborhoods or in their communities, absolutely want police because they want somebody to show up when they have an emergency. They want somebody to address the crises that might be happening, that are happening in their neighborhood or happening to themselves. And that is a very, very human inclination. I feel the same way. I absolutely want I want people, trained people, to be able to show up if I or my family has a crisis. I think the difference that I'm talking about is that a lot of people aren't even aware that an unarmed crisis response program could exist in their community. They're not even aware that that alternative option exists. So part of my answer to your question is, to me, and part of what part of why I wrote the book is thinking about how do we expand the conversation about some of these alternatives, not in a way to say this is definitely the answer and we need to go down this path for sure, but rather here are the range of possibilities. we are dedicating this much budget to this thing, and then what is a community-led, community-driven process to make the decisions based on that evidence and that information? Because I think as I talk about prevention thinking in the book, one of the key aspects of it I talk about is nothing about us without us, or that impacted communities need to be a part of the decision making. So I certainly don't think it's my role to be making decision on behalf of communities, but I think frankly some of the narrative in this country is that this is the only way to promote public safety, or this is the only way to deal with violence, is using prisons. And the evidence, both from public health but also other fields, show that that's just not true. There
Yeah.
are a lot of other ways to approach these societal problems. So I think the trick is that a lot of the broader public isn't necessarily aware of some of those alternatives. I think one of the things we can do as public health professionals is talk about what some of these alternatives are, and then also help foster environments where communities can actually talk through what investments do they want, or states can really have a full debate or dialogue about what is it that we want for our state, our country.
Yeah. Um, so a lot of really great ideas here, and I don't want to get drilled because I'm increasingly thinking about the nuance of us just saying community engagement and what that means. And I like the line where it said nothing for us without us, uh, or about us without us. But it's interesting to me, and as someone who worked on female genital mutilation in Sudan, I tell this story a lot of the time. When people just say to me, "We just need to get the community voices on priorities," I tell them that change over time, of course. But when I was still working there a few years ago, maybe 15 years ago, it would have been impossible for me to imagine a world where female genital mutilation of young girls in the community would have been a priority. So if that's the case, then how do we engage the voices of those people who are actually really affected in the village that I work with? Those are the ones affected who would not necessarily have a voice in that conversation. And I think the NIMBYism movement here in the US also is a good example. When we say community, who do we mean? Who's actually engaging in that conversation when we're talking about zoning in an area? And NIMBYism, for those who don't know, is not in my neighborhood, where people say, great, we need more housing, but that they don't necessarily then vote for more housing in their areas. And usually zoning laws in the US prevent really focus on the incumbents, people who are living in a certain area, instead of people who might benefit from building more housing. So I appreciate you adding nuance to the idea of thinking about community. I think there are a lot of areas we might agree on, but also some areas I would love to even flesh out some more. But I want to talk more about your book, so maybe we'll have you for a different conversation, and having people who are actually in the community talk to us more about how can public health have a more nuanced conversation about communities and community-led initiatives. So just before we move forward to the practical or action framework sections in your book, which I think they provide a concrete way of thinking about what we need to do, I wanted to just maybe quickly discuss one of the stories you provide in the environment section, because I thought that was just a good illustration of how things could maybe start with a good vision, but then don't necessarily end in a place that helps the public. And that was, I think, the Gilman Science story. So maybe you just tell the listeners about that story.
Yeah, I think so. Part of that story is that, there's a company that is started with the aim of measuring air pollution. And it then actually occurred here in Ann Arbor, where I am based, Ann Arbor, Michigan.
And a public health
And
student, right, who
a
led it?
public health student
Yeah,
started it. Yes,
yeah,
exactly, from my university.
yeah.
And so, but over the years, the company grew, and it, through the work that they were doing, they eventually had, um, they were developing products here in Ann Arbor, and they had, waste that they were trying to dispose of, and ultimately they disposed it in the area around their headquarters, which happens to be, about a mile from where I live, and that ultimately, that waste eventually found its way into the groundwater, and that waste was found to be, harmful. And so it's a real concern here in our community. And I think part of the reason I tell that story is a couple of reasons. One, you know, Ann Arbor is a highly educated, relatively wealthy, predominantly white town, and so environmental disasters can happen anywhere. Uh, they disproportionately affect communities that tend to be predominantly Black or predominantly poor. And so that is an important part about kind of the environmental injustice that happens in our country. And these are happening everywhere. And so when we think about prevention thinking or we think about the environment, we do certainly want to reduce the inequities. We want to prevent it that environmental harms are disproportionately occurring to marginalized communities. That is certainly true. But ultimately, I think we can dream bigger for our ourselves. We want no environmental harms to any of our communities, right? And so that's part of the story that I try to tell is just that waste disposal that happened in Ann Arbor, it happened in a very legal way. You know, there have been lawsuits and there's been back and forth, certainly, but ultimately they were sort of following the rules, but the rules allowed for this type of thing. And so now we have this contaminant in our groundwater. And so it can be a real issue. So I think part of applying a prevention thinking lens is how do we think about industry and how do we think about businesses in preventing some of these harms before they happen, rather than always thinking from the lens of how is our EPA or how is our government going to clean up the mess afterwards.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking, what would an economist say? So I think they would probably say, could we think about the trade-offs, even if they had the water affecting people or wastewater that was bad for the local environment? Maybe providing that device that would measure pollution on a larger scale would have benefits. And I don't disagree with trade-off thinking. I actually think that is something we miss in public health sometimes when we think about our what we propose. But I do think a prevention thinking approach would have said from the beginning, yes, having the pollution devices is probably helpful, but maybe from the beginning thinking, how do we minimize the local impact? And instead of saying, ultimately, this is just going to happen and we have to live with that trade off. So that is what I appreciate about the prevention thinking approach. At least I don't want to put words in your mouth where it just says from the beginning, if you envision something different, that might actually lead you to take different choices. And instead of saying this was just a completely good or a completely bad decision to take, versus when you decided to take one route versus the other, if you had taken a prevention approach to it, would that have made your choices different? So then let's shift to your second part of the book, where you shifted from diagnosis to prescription. And I think you started with thinking or trying to get the reader to think about where do we transform, how do we transform, and what do we transform? And I think I want to start first with where do we transform, because you make a distinction between transforming ourselves and transforming our communities. And I was wondering, why did you think that was distinction was really important and you had to make different chapters about it?
Maybe this just somewhat gets into the nuance of writing, but again, started writing a chapter on where we transform, and I guess I had a lot to say, so I
Yeah.
ultimately divided into two chapters. But I think part of where that came from was as I was writing the the sort of internal reflection piece. We know within public health, we often talk about the importance of critical self-reflection. How do we think about our own identities as we're doing the work? How do we think about power dynamics between ourselves and the communities that we are partnering with? And so that internal reflection is an important part of our field. But as we're thinking about change work, if we want to be change makers, or if we want to help create better societies, we need to be very attuned to who we are, first and foremost, and we need to be very attuned to what we might need to change within ourselves, because every day we are out there interacting with different people, and we need to think critically about what we're bringing to the table, and then also what is it that we first off, what do we have to offer, but where can we better partner? How can we think about ourselves? How can we think about what our unique role is? I think that's something in talking with students a lot. They they're unsure of what role they should be playing in society. I think at least in the students I'm teaching, there is this desire to create a better world, to be transformational, to be a change maker. But there's so many different ways to do that, and actually, we need all different sorts of people. Some people do it as their profession. They earn a salary doing work that contributes. Some people drop off casseroles and cookies for neighborhood organizers to help sustain them, right? Both of those things are actually really important to the ecosystem of how we make change. And so I think part of the chapter on where we transform, thinking about ourselves first, is thinking about, well, how are we connected to the issues that we want to change? Really understanding that can help you identify, well, what role do I have to play? Because somebody who is directly impacted by an issue or their community is directly harmed, the way that they might engage is going to look a lot of different than somebody who is connected to the issue in a very different way. And so I think that's an important thing to tease out. And as kind of alluded to, I myself, I grew up in a suburb outside of Chicago. I have certain roots and identities that shape who I am, right? So I am not the directly impacted person for a lot of the harms within our society. So what that means is I have different connections. And one of the things I write about in the book is, in many ways, the suburb that I grew up in had a lot of resources because policies helped create benefits for my community, while it was simultaneously those same policies were depriving other communities. So even though I'm not directly impacted, I am connected to it because some of the benefits and advantages that I've had in my life are connected to those same policies that are causing harm in other areas. And so I think me being able to understand that and thinking, prompting readers to help unpack where they're at as it relates to our policies and institutions is an important part of that chapter.
So then you move to thinking about how do we transform and what do we transform. So can you give us an idea of what does that mean for the reader, and what areas should they focus on?
So I think what I was trying to do, and you know, I was trying to frame the last part of the book as, what are practical things that we all can be doing as we're thinking about making change within our communities and our society. And so what I was really trying to do is sort of divide it up almost as a roadmap in a way. And I want to be clear, it's just one roadmap.
Yeah.
You could talk to 100 different people and get 100 different roadmaps and ideas. And actually, that is something we should do. We should all be having conversations with each other about what should we be doing to make change in our communities. Um, so, but one of the things I was trying to think of is, like, really trying to categorize out where can we focus. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about is, one area we want to be focusing on is, what are some of the kind of roots of our decision making in society. And so that's where I talk about, really boosting our democratic systems and civic participation systems. So not just trying to make a policy change related to a specific issue, but actually one of the things that we can do to make change in our societies is focus on, how are decisions even made in the first place? Who has access to voting? When we vote, is it gerrymandered districts, or can we think about ways that the districts are more equal? For example, in the state of Michigan, we have a nonpartisan district. Yeah, what a word! Districting commission. That helps set the districts for the state. And that actually came from an initiative within the state of Michigan, a citizen-led initiative to put something on the ballot that we would have a nonpartisan commission do that work instead of the state legislature. So that's just one example of how, that effort took a lot of people power, a lot of organizing. And that organizing could have been focused in other areas, right? People could have spent all that energy yelling on social media or doing something else. But they put that energy into actually organizing, getting signatures, getting this issue on the ballot, helping people understand the gerrymandering process and why a redistricting commission that's nonpartisan could be important. And so when I talk about the sort of where we transform or thinking, it's about sharpening our lens. I think there's a famous saying. I'm not sure who said it, but if there's a bunch of wood that needs to be chopped, and you have 6 hours to chop it, spend the first 5 hours sharpening your axe,
Yeah.
right? And so it's part of it is thinking about, if we are going to spend energy towards this thing, and to some extent we all do, right? We see things happening in the world and we get upset about them, and then we do something. Um, and part of it is thinking about, well, what are the productive ways to channel some of that energy if we do want to do something? And so that's just one example of it.
I think this is great. And I actually maybe just quickly asking you, if you have to pick, given the different chapters you have about action, if someone has to think about one arena in the world we're living in right now and thinking, I want to imagine doing better, what would you ask them to focus right now? If they're in the US, not in a different country, should they focus on themselves, their community, or the system? And what would be the greatest leverage for them to be working on right now?
Wow, that's such a good question. I think I don't have a clear answer, because I think to some extent it depends on who you are, right? So some people have done the work to understand who they are and where they're situated and how they connect to different issues. And so for them, maybe they can skip forward to some other parts. But if you're newer to the work or newer to that type of thinking, that's probably where you want to be starting, right? I think another point I try to make in the book is, starting local can be a really important place to start. And I think right now there is so much attention to what's happening at the federal level in the U.S., and that is an important place to be seeing what's happening, and it's having big impacts. Um, but it can be hard for folks to feel like they can make a change in that area. It's so big, but at a local level, you can have a much more immediate impact. And so one of the things that when I talk to folks, and this especially comes up in conversations with students of, well, what can I be doing? Think about what institutions or groups or communities that you are a part of. For some folks, like for myself, I am a parent within a school community, right? So and it's an elementary school. So that is a kind of community institution I'm a part of. Um, you may be part of a club, you may be part of even a friend group, right? And so what would change look like in that place? And I think this actually gets back to the 7 generation thinking, or at least the future orientation. We are not going to completely transform our society overnight. It's not going to happen in the next year. It's not going to happen in the next decade. It is generational work. And I was actually just having a conversation with someone recently. Saying that it's generational work does not mean, oh, phew, I don't have to do anything. My kids will take care of it. But what it means is we are in a relay race, right? So I am running the leg right now. What can I do so that when I pass it off to my kids or other kids in the next generation, they are starting from a better place than where I started? And that their role is really moving the needle and starting from a better place than where I handed it off. So getting back to the local institutions, thinking about the change we make in our local institutions is, first dream, using that imagination, reflecting on what the system or the institution is doing. Where is inequity showing up? Where is it not serving the community as well as it could? And then what are the changes that you can start to make? Who are the people that you can bring together to start to make those changes? And eventually, if you keep at it, keep taking steps forward, you're not going to change it overnight. But eventually, that relay race, that institution, that place will be in a better spot when you leave it, when you hand off the baton to somebody else. And so I think that's the kind of thinking that we all need to have, because what is happening in the wider world, I know for a lot of folks, can feel immobilizing. They can feel despair sometimes. I hear a lot of folks talk about hopelessness. And so what I try to remind myself is, where am I already connected in, and what are some small steps I can take? Because it is that forward motion that I think will propel us to a different place.
This is interesting. It's as if you're reading my mind about the next question I had for you, which is it's really and I struggle with this. In my country we had a dictator for who was in office before I actually was born, and I only mention this because I we always struggled with our student movement on whether we need to do something more incremental versus we need to do something more drastic. And then ultimately, I don't know, we ultimately did the drastic thing and we had a revolution. And I'm not sure if I asked my mother today, I'm not sure she would say Sudan is in a better place today because we did not build more concrete, more stable systems before just blowing up the system itself. So I really don't know what was the correct answer there. But I just say this because I after that I started really struggling with, there is a tension when we say we need to have a step-by-step plan. People think of it as more incremental, and then that could lead to transformative change. And I think you can get some people who say, "Oh, oof, that means maybe I don't need to do anything, or I'm hopeless." But I wonder if you also get people, and that was me 10 years ago, who would say, "Well, that does that mean you're just giving up because you are not really taking the drastic change that is needed right now?" I don't know the answer to that. I'm really struggling now with whether what we did when we trying to get something changed drastically in Sudan was ultimately helpful for the population or not. I don't know the answer to that. So I don't know if you also think about the tension between incremental, step-by-step change and thinking about transformative change for the entire system.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's such a good point, and it is. I think it's a key tension, and I won't pretend to know that I have the answers, but I do. I think where I personally sit on it and land on it is that we can we can push for change, and we need to be ready for when there's an opening for bigger change. And we see that across our history, right? That there are sometimes it seems like things happened overnight. It seems like there were shifts that happened, but what really happened was there was organizing, there was movement, there was action sort of bubbling beneath the surface or happening, and people were working, they were moving it forward, they were making incremental change. And I think part of it is being ready for when those moments come to be able to take bigger steps. And so I think that's how I think of it. I know there's a lot of different folks that might have different perspectives on that question, but you're absolutely right. I think, and a lot of people are really thinking deeply about that tension of how do we make change? Is incremental enough, or do we need to be more drastic? But I think when I go back to the kind of place I started, which is building connection within your community, thinking about the human to human relationships, connecting within a community, and then trying to take steps towards a vision together. I think that's what's going to get us towards change, um, in a sustainable way, where there's going to be maybe less backlash, less reaction, back and forth. Because I think we do want to. It's not just about it's not just about me advocating a vision and sort of forcing it on my community. It's actually about me articulating a vision, asking my neighbors what their vision is, and then us working together towards something. And so I think that's the key, is if we are collaborative in nature with some of these incremental steps, I think it eventually becomes a cascade. It becomes a bigger force, for change.
Yeah. And I mentioned this earlier, but before that, I so Milton Friedman, which I assume just reading your book, probably you don't agree on a lot when it comes to economic
Sure.
policies. He has a really interesting saying. I'm going to butcher it, but I think he said, and I guess time proved him right. You do a lot of writing. You put your thinking out there because you never know when it's going to be the window for it to actually be taken up, which is exactly what I think happened with his thinking and the Reagan administration. So I always found that to be very motivating for someone who I think when he started writing, he just wrote because that's what he believed in. And then there was a window, exactly what you were saying, where for people, it would feel like it was overnight that Reagan changed the economic thinking of the country, but it was really writing by people like Milton Friedman and other people that led to that change. So from his perspective, that is the work that he needed to do. And agree or disagree with him, I think that's actually a good way to think about like what is my part that I need to do, and you never know when there's going to be a moment for a change. So I think I mentioned this earlier, and maybe because I'm really stuck on this, and maybe I'm looking up for you at you for answers. Um, Thinking about our values versus empirical evidence, and thinking about when presenting empirical evidence, and after that providing a normative statement. Can that create some tension, especially if we're trying to communicate with people who have differing values? So, let's for example, you empirically highlight, I think, strongly in the book that incarceration is expensive, and in a lot of the times it's just ineffective in reducing crime. But then there's also a value question. If we find out that even if prison did reduce crime, would mass incarceration still be worth the human cost? So that's just on one end of it. So even if the evidence just shows that it does reduce crime, but we still have mass incarceration, is that a good point to take? But on the other hand, what if there are people who say it could be as expensive as possible? And I think I mentioned this earlier, but I do believe my value system says if someone does something wrong, they have to go to prison. I don't care how expensive it is. So when we make that empirical statement, is it helpful to have a normative statement right after it? And I know your book is for a vision, so likely you would need to make a normative statement about what you think is needed. But I always struggle with in our public health writing, and I think we've seen this even during COVID. How do we make people realize this is what I mean when I say this is the empirical evidence, and this is my normative statement stemming from my values, and maybe we should find a way to distinguish between the two.
Yeah. Oh, such an important question. I mean, I think first I might distinguish between different types of writing. An academic journal is intended to be more of a place where we present some of the evidence that we have. And so I do think in that setting, being, a little more tying up close to the evidence. We are reporting what data says. I think it's important to talk about both the limitations, but also what that data might indicate for us in terms of what we would do differently. Oftentimes in a journal article that comes in a discussion section, which oftentimes the reader knows this is a little bit of the author's own viewpoint or ideas that are coming through, connected to the data, right? So I think, but if you're writing an op-ed, and I absolutely think that those of us in public health should be part of the public discourse that is such things as op-eds or even this podcast, right? And I do think it is important to be clear about when we are talking about evidence and when we are talking about our own perspective. And so I think those distinctions are good. I think we do need to anchor ourselves in values, and I think one of the things that can really help us in this moment is talking more clearly about our values. And I think that's something that actually we don't do enough of in public health, and we don't do enough of in the broader society. I think if we talked at the values level, um, and by values I mean really sort of deep core values, we would not find the same polarization that we see so present in the media and social media and the discourse today. There is a lot of alignment across communities on the types of values we hold. Now, I'm not naive to believe that all those values align, and I'm not naive to believe that getting people into a room, we would all just ultimately agree. That's certainly not the case. But I think starting conversations from a perspective of values, where am I coming from? What value am I holding dear as I'm entering this conversation? Actually really helps the person understand what perspective you're coming from, right? And so somebody might have um, like a deeper value connected to human dignity, and that's where they're coming to the conversation about what do we do with people who commit violence in our society. Somebody else might be coming with a different value. And it's really important to understand that value, because most of the values are things, even if it's not our deeply held value, we can understand why somebody might hold a different value. Now, once those values turn into political beliefs and policy beliefs, that's when we start arguing with each other. That's when things can get really contentious. Um, but I do think starting from a place of values, and those of us within public health, being clear about what some of the values are that drive our work, I think actually would help other people understand the work better. Doesn't mean that they're always going to agree with the conclusions, but it does give a fuller picture of the data, and the conclusions that we're making.
Yeah. So thinking about the ending of your book, you say making a better world possible. And I thought that was an interesting word choice instead of probable or certain. And I was wondering, why did you choose to end with a possibility instead of certainty of, if you do this, if we do all of the things I'm suggesting, we would certainly have a better world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of it is a bit of humility that I don't know. I don't know what the future holds, right? And I do think though that what we are talking about when we think about future orientation is the possibility, what is possible, and that we need to be anchoring ourselves in the what could be and working towards that thing. We have to create that vision for a better world and do our best to make it possible. Um, I do hold on to hope. I think that's a really important part of this work. I do think that we will have a world that is better than the one we have today in terms of helping people thrive, helping people prosper, um, community connection, etc. Um, but none of us know the future, and so I think part of that's part of what motivates me is I think ultimately we could go in a million different directions from this spot right now. Um, and it is on us, both individually and collectively, to shape that world and make that different world possible.
So the podcast is called Complicating the Narrative. I have to end with asking you, what do you think there's a narrative about prevention that requires being complicated? Otherwise, we will not move in a direction that helps us think about prevention as a way to advance the health of the population.
I think the thing that, at least in terms of the public narrative, that prevention is an individual responsibility. I think that's the narrative that needs to be complicated. Um, that it's sort of an individual thing that we have to prevent in our own lives, um, because really it's a collective responsibility. It is a government responsibility. It is an institutional responsibility to be thinking with this prevention lens of how do we actually prevent harms, prevent bad things from happening in the first place. And so I think that's the thing that I wish we would have more conversations about, of that the role that government, the role that institutions, the role that systems can play in preventing harms.
Paul, thank you for joining us today. The book is Imagine Doing Better. I enjoyed reading it and debating with it out loud as I wrote my notes on the side. I think it's available on October 14th, if I'm not mistaken. And
That's
I
right.
hope
The
I
book
can
is
bring,
released. Yep,
yeah,
October 14th.
excellent. And I hope we can bring you back to discuss some of the specific ideas in the book at a later time. Thank you, Paul.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This podcast was edited by Zach Leonaris and Catalina Melendez Contreras. It is supported by the School of Public Health and Frick Initiative at Washington University in St. Louis. You can access this and other episodes wherever you get your podcast, or you can watch it on video on YouTube. Thank you for watching.